I'm 74 years old, and I only became aware of my own irrelevance 3 years ago, sitting in my living room on a Tuesday morning, watching my son take inventory of my life like a man appraising items for an estate sale. Let me back up. That's not the beginning, not really. The beginning was much quieter than that, so quiet I almost missed it entirely. But I suppose all the meaningful changes in life happen that way, not with fanfare or explicit declaration, but in the spaces between what's said and what's understood, in the silences that grow longer, in the way your adult child's eyes start to move past you rather than toward you. I'm Jackson Rathbone. That name probably means nothing to you, which is exactly how I like it. I've spent most of my 74 years deliberately avoiding attention, earning a living, raising a son, and building what I thought was a solid life. Nothing spectacular, nothing worth writing home about, just the steady, mundane accumulation of days. My wife, Margaret, used to say I was made for the background. You're the kind of man who could walk into a room full of strangers and be the last person anyone remembers, she said once, and I remember wondering if she meant it as an insult. She wasn't smiling exactly, but there was something fond in her voice. We were married for 47 years. She died 6 years ago, heart attack. One moment she was making tea in the kitchen, the next moment everything was different. After she died, I discovered that a person can go through all the motions of living without actually being alive. I woke up, I made coffee, I read the newspaper, I went to the grocery store on Wednesdays because that was the day the produce was fresh. I attended church on Sundays, sitting in the same pew, singing the same hymns, but nothing touched me anymore. It was as if Margaret had been the only person who could really see me, and once she was gone, I became invisible to everyone else, including myself. My son, Michael, was 39 when his mother died. He had his own life by then, a high-powered job at an investment firm, a nice house in the suburbs, a wife named Patricia who smiled in that careful way that suggested she was always aware of being observed. They had 2 children, Emma and Daniel, though I saw them perhaps 4 times a year. That had been the steady state of our relationship for years before Margaret's death, and it remained the same after. Nothing changed, except my wife stopped calling them with updates about my life. I don't blame Michael for that distance. He had his own world to maintain, his own concerns. There's a certain ruthlessness required to build wealth and maintain status in this country, and my son possessed it in abundance. I was proud of him for that, I think, or perhaps I was resigned to it. It's hard to distinguish pride from resignation when you reach my age. The house we lived in, where Margaret and I had spent 41 years, was paid off by 1995. We'd bought it in 1954 for $8,400, a small ranch-style home with 3 bedrooms and a yard that needed constant attention. The neighborhood had changed around us. Families moved out, immigrant families moved in, then those communities shifted too. By the time Margaret died, our street was lined with homes owned by people working multiple jobs, living in multi-generational configurations, building their own quiet lives alongside ours. I stayed in that house after Margaret died. It never occurred to me to leave. The place was full of her, the way she'd arranged the living room, the herb garden she maintained on the south side, the reading nook by the front window where she'd sat with her books and her endless mugs of tea. Every room contained some evidence of her decisions, her taste, her presence. To leave would have felt like abandonment. About a year after Margaret's funeral, Michael started mentioning that I should think about moving, just casually dropping it into conversations like a small test balloon. "These older homes require so much upkeep, Dad," he said one Sunday when he came by for dinner. I'd made his favorite, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, the recipe Margaret had perfected over decades. He was sitting at the kitchen table, and I remember he had the same expression he'd worn when he was a teenager, a kind of pleasant detachment, as if he were commenting on something he'd seen in a documentary rather than something in his own family. "The roof will last another 5 years, probably," I told him. "The foundation is solid." "That's not what I mean," he said. He wasn't unkind about it, just factual. "These places depreciate in neighborhoods like this. Have you thought about moving somewhere more appropriate, somewhere with maintenance included, a community for active seniors?" I didn't respond to that. I finished making the salad, dressing the greens with the vinaigrette I'd learned to make from watching Margaret do it 1,000 times. At the table, Michael ate efficiently, without lingering. He left early, citing work obligations. Over the next 2 years, these conversations happened with increasing frequency. Michael became more insistent, more detailed in his suggestions. He'd send me information about various active senior communities, printouts with glossy photographs of smiling retirees playing golf or doing water aerobics. Patricia would mention, almost casually, that it seemed like a lot of burden for a man my age to handle alone. Even Emma and Daniel, during their increasingly rare visits, would comment on the age of the house, the dated decor, the worn carpet in the hallway. I suppose I should have recognized what was happening, but I was so accustomed to being irrelevant that I didn't understand I was being strategically removed from the picture. I thought they simply cared. I thought they were concerned about my well-being. It took me a long time to realize there was a difference between these things. The first sign of trouble came on a Thursday in late September, about 14 months before the day I mentioned at the beginning, the Tuesday morning when everything became clear. Michael called, which was unusual. He generally communicated through brief texts or scheduled visits. A phone call from my son had a quality of formality that made me nervous. "Dad, I need to talk to you about some practical matters," he said, and immediately my stomach tightened. Practical matters. That phrase contained no warmth. "Of course, is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," he said, but his voice suggested the opposite. "I've just been thinking about estate planning. As your son, as your closest relative, I need to understand what arrangements you've made. Do you have a will, life insurance? What about the house, the deed? Is it in your name or joint with Mom?" I wasn't prepared for these questions, though I should have been. These are things responsible people discuss with their parents, things a man in his mid-60s should have already sorted out with his own son, but Margaret had always handled the financial aspects of our marriage. I had worked, earned money, paid bills, but the deeper structures of our finances remained somewhat opaque to me. I knew we owned the house. I knew Margaret had some savings. Beyond that, the details felt less important than the basic fact. I had enough to live on, and that seemed sufficient. "I'll have to look into it," I told him. "I can call our lawyer or—" "Let me help you with that," Michael said, and this is where I should have heard the shift in his voice, the change in intonation that signals possession. "Why don't you gather all the documents, bank statements, insurance policies, the deed to the house, anything like that? I'll come over on Sunday and we can go through it together." He arrived Sunday at 10 in the morning, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing an expression I'd never quite seen on him before, something between helpfulness and hunger. Patricia was with him, which was unusual. She generally avoided family financial discussions, or at least pretended to. She stood in my living room with her hands folded, observing. Michael spread documents across my dining table. He had a list, I realized. He'd come prepared with specific questions. How much was the monthly property tax? What was the insurance on the house? Did I have medical insurance? Who was my beneficiary on various accounts? I answered what I could. The things I didn't know, I said I didn't know. This seemed to frustrate him, though he maintained his pleasant tone throughout. "You've never taken an active role in your own finances," he said, not as a question. "Your mother preferred to manage those things," I said. "Well, that creates a problem," he said, "because now you don't have anyone to manage them for you. And as you age, this is going to become increasingly complicated. You need to be involved in the process." "I'll take a class," I offered. "I can learn." "Or," Patricia interjected smoothly, "Michael could help manage things for you. It's not uncommon for adult children to take over financial management for aging parents. It makes things much simpler." I looked at her, trying to understand the subtext beneath her words. There was something wrong here, something that didn't align with simple filial concern. But I'd spent 74 years being wrong about people's intentions, and at that point in my life, I was tired of trying to interpret meaning that might not be there. Sometimes people are just offering help. Sometimes they mean well. It's easier to believe that than to believe otherwise. "I suppose," I said slowly, "that could be helpful." Michael smiled, and I remember the quality of relief in that smile. It was the smile of a man who had just successfully negotiated something he'd been working toward. Over the following weeks, he took control of my finances. Not all at once, not in a dramatic way. He would come over, ask me to sign documents that transferred access to various accounts. A bank account that had been in my name would become a joint account. Insurance policies that had named Margaret as my beneficiary were updated to name Michael. These things felt like small adjustments, like maintenance, until you stepped back and saw the shape they formed. The house was the last piece. The deed had been in both Margaret's name and mine, a joint tenancy that meant the property would automatically transfer to the surviving spouse if one of us died. When Margaret died, it should have become my property alone. But Margaret's will was structured in a way I'd never fully understood. There were trust agreements and provisions that Michael explained with patient condescension, breaking down concepts I didn't grasp into smaller and smaller pieces. Basically, he said, walking me through pages of legal language, Mom set things up so that her portion of the house is held in trust for you for your lifetime, but after you die, it passes to me. It's a form of asset protection. It means if you ever need extended care, the house can't be seized to pay for it. Mom was protecting the family estate. I nodded, though I didn't fully understand. This sounded like something Margaret would do, protective, forward-thinking, concerned with contingencies. The specific mechanisms remained murky to me. I signed the papers Michael put in front of me. I trusted him. That was the pattern that developed. Trust, followed by small surrenders, followed by larger ones. He suggested that I put the house in a property arrangement that he described as beneficial for tax purposes. There were advantages, he explained. The language was dense. I signed. The deed changed. What I didn't understand at the time was that while the house remained in my name, Michael now had power of attorney over it. What I didn't fully process was that he had become the administrator of my life. The turning point came on that Tuesday in September, almost a year after these financial arrangements began. Michael arrived at 9 a.m. with Patricia and a stranger, a real estate agent with kind eyes and a measuring tape. They began, systematically, taking measurements and photographs of my home. "What's happening?" I asked, though some part of me already knew. "We are having the house appraised," Michael said. He wasn't unkind, just matter of fact. "For the estate, and potentially for selling." "Selling the house?" "You can't live here forever, Dad," he said, and this is where I finally heard the irritation beneath his voice, the frustration that had been building. "You're 73 years old. This house has 2 stories. The stairs are going to become a problem. The yard is an acre. You can't maintain that alone. And frankly, this neighborhood is," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "not what it was when you and Mom bought it." I stared at him. I was standing in my own living room, and my son was talking about it as if it were already his. As if my presence, there was a temporary inconvenience that he was graciously allowing, but was now ready to address. "I don't want to sell the house," I said. "You don't have a choice," he said, and those words, just those 4 words, changed the entire landscape of my life. I didn't argue, I didn't fight back. I remember Patricia looking away when he said that, and some part of me appreciated her discomfort. At least she recognized that a line had been crossed. But I didn't fight because Margaret had taught me that fighting rarely changed outcomes. Fighting exhausted you and left you bitter. Better to endure, she used to say. Better to maintain your dignity through acceptance. And besides, as Michael was so quick to remind me, the house had never technically been in my name alone. It existed in a complex web of trusts and joint tenancies and power of attorney arrangements that he now controlled. What I thought I owned, I didn't. What I thought was mine had always been contingent, conditional, subject to his interpretation of what was best. The house sold in February. It went for $320,000, more than I would have expected given the neighborhood. Michael had made smart decisions about how to market it. A young family with a baby bought it, people who looked at my home, Margaret's home, and saw potential. I was moved to a 1-bedroom apartment in a senior living community called Sunrise Gardens, located in a part of town I didn't know well, near the highway, with a view of the parking lot. The apartment was clean and modern. There was a fitness center and a dining facility where meals were provided. Activity coordinators offered programming, bingo on Thursdays, water aerobics on Tuesday and Friday, a painting class that I attended once and never returned to. Michael paid for it with money from the house sale, not because he wanted to support me, though he framed it that way, but because he was the one making decisions now. I didn't choose where I lived. I didn't choose how my money was spent. Michael had explained very carefully that I was now unable to manage my own affairs. He had power of attorney. He would handle everything for my own good. "It's for your protection," he said, as if this mattered. As if the kindness of his intentions changed the fact that my autonomy had been dissolved like sugar in water. The first 6 months at Sunrise Gardens were the darkest period of my life. And that's saying something, because I'd already lived through my wife's death, the loss of my home, the systematic dismantling of my independence. But in that first half year, I reached depths I didn't know existed. I would sit in my apartment, clean, temperature-controlled, soulless, and feel as if I were already dead. The place smelled like linen spray and industrial cleaner. There were no books with spines creased by repeated reading. There were no photographs on the walls. There was nothing that suggested a person actually lived here. It felt like a waiting room, like a space designed to warehouse bodies until they were ready to be processed by whatever came next. The other residents were kind, mostly. Many of them had also lost their homes, their independence, the lives they'd built. We'd sit together in the common areas, playing cards or watching television, and there was a quality of grim camaraderie in it. We were warehoused together, and we tried to make the best of it. There was a woman named Shirley who sat near me during activities. She had been an accountant, she told me, before arthritis made it impossible to work. Her daughter had convinced her to move to Sunrise Gardens. "She said I was a burden," Shirley said matter-of-factly. "My own daughter. She said I was becoming a burden, and it would be easier for everyone if I moved somewhere that could take care of me. She visits every 3 months, sometimes." I didn't tell Shirley my story. I didn't know how to explain that I hadn't even had the dignity of being called a burden. I simply ceased to matter, and the machinery of my removal had been so efficient, so clothed in the language of care and protection, that I'd been unable to resist it. I stopped eating well. The food at Sunrise Gardens was nutritionally sound, but tasted like cardboard. I stopped attending activities. I spent most of my time in my apartment, reading old books that I'd carried with me from my real house, worn paperbacks, their spines broken, their margins annotated in pencil by a younger version of myself who had thoughts about literature. It was during this period that I started thinking about death not as a distant inevitability, but as a practical solution to my current circumstances. I didn't make a plan exactly, but I began cataloging the ways it could happen. The pills in the bathroom, left over from Margaret's final illness. The parking lot, so close to traffic. The opportunity to simply refuse, to stop eating. To stop getting up, to allow myself to dissolve. I don't say this to garner sympathy. I mention it because it matters to what comes next. I was a man without agency, without purpose, waiting for permission to stop existing. The tragedy wasn't that my son had stolen my life. It was that I'd been willing to let him. Michael visited perhaps once every 6 weeks. He would arrive with Patricia always, as if my presence required a witness. They would ask how I was doing, and I would tell them I was fine, and they would look relieved that nothing was required of them. He would give me a summary of my financial status. The house proceeds had been invested. The returns were good. I was being well provided for. This was meant to comfort me, I think. This was meant to suggest that he had done the right thing, that his management of my life had been justified. Patricia sometimes brought me small gifts, a new shirt, a book she thought I might enjoy, a puzzle. These tokens of kindness were worse than indifference. They suggested that she recognized I was unhappy and thought consumer goods might address the problem. It was the charity of someone soothing their own conscience. On one of these visits, I asked Michael if there was any possibility of my retrieving some measure of autonomy. "What do you mean?" he asked, genuinely puzzled, as if I was expressing a desire that made no sense. "I could manage some of my own money," I suggested, "a small allowance. Perhaps I could." "Absolutely not," he said, and this time there was no pretense of gentleness. Dad, you demonstrated that you can't manage finances, you don't understand investments or tax implications. You'd made poor decisions left and right. I took over precisely because you can't handle it. I wanted to argue that no one had given me a chance to learn, that his takeover had been predetermined rather than reactive. But I didn't. Arguing seemed to agitate him, and I'd learned that it was easier to accept his narrative of my incompetence than to challenge it. I was 74 years old and entirely dependent on a man who considered me incompetent. I had built a life, worked for 50 years, made decisions, raised a child, but all of that had been erased. I was, to use his own words, too old to matter. That's where the story might have ended. Me in a one-bedroom apartment with a parking lot view, waiting to fade away quietly. Michael in his house in the suburbs, managing my affairs, feeling satisfied that he had done the responsible thing. Patricia maintaining her distance from the ugliness of it all. A tidy ending, the kind that happens all the time to people nobody remembers. But something interrupted that trajectory, something small, something that I would have missed entirely if I hadn't been the kind of person who noticed things. I was walking in the parking lot of Sunrise Gardens on a grey November afternoon, mandatory exercise, basically, though I framed it to myself as something I chose. There was a cafe nearby, the kind of place that served coffee to people who worked in the surrounding office parks. I'd walked past it countless times but never gone in. It felt too public, too risky. People at Sunrise Gardens didn't venture into the outside world. We were past that. But on this particular afternoon, I decided I was tired of not doing things because I was afraid. I was already invisible. I was already dispossessed. What did it matter if I sat in a cafe like a normal person? Inside, it was warm and smelled like coffee and cinnamon. There was a line of people waiting for drinks, mostly younger, office workers, a few creative types with laptops, a construction worker in his work clothes. I joined the line, unsure what to order. When I reached the counter, I asked for a medium coffee with cream. The person behind the counter was a young man, probably in his 20s, with an eyebrow piercing and kind eyes. He made my coffee and handed it to me, and I turned to look for a seat. "That'll be $5.95, someone said. I turned back. A man had approached from the back of the cafe, the owner, I assumed. He was tall, probably in his 50s, with dark hair threaded with grey, and he was looking at me with an expression I couldn't parse. "I'm sorry, what?" I said. "Your coffee, $5.95. I reached for my wallet. This is where things get strange, because I had very little money on me. Michael had arranged for that. My bills were paid through automatic transfers. My money was invested. What I had cash-wise was minimal. He'd explained that it was for security. If I lost my purse or had it stolen, I wouldn't lose much. At least, that was his justification. I had about $8 in my wallet. "I apologize," I said, pulling out what I had. "I don't have quite enough." The owner continued to look at me. The barista, the young man with the piercing, suddenly seemed very interested in the cappuccino machine. The other customers had stopped ordering. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen. "Let me guess," the owner said, "you're not carrying a card because your son manages your money." I looked up at him. "I'm sorry, I don't." "I'll cover it," he said, and he pulled out a wallet from his back pocket and handed a credit card to the barista. "It's on me." I wanted to refuse, but something in his voice suggested that it wasn't really an offer. He was saying something, and I needed to listen. "Thank you," I said. "Go sit down," he said. "We need to talk." My first instinct was to leave. This stranger, this man, had approached me with a kind of knowing that was unsettling. I didn't want to be known. I'd spent the last year perfecting invisibility, but I'd also spent a year dying slowly, and there was a part of me that was curious what dying faster might look like. I sat at a small table by the window. The man, I still didn't know his name, finished with his business at the counter and then came and sat down across from me without asking permission. "My name is Samuel Chen," he said, "and I think someone's stealing from you." I didn't respond immediately. I looked at my coffee as if it might contain answers. The steam rose in small, delicate spirals. Outside, the world continued. People walking, cars passing, the ordinary traffic of lives moving forward. My son is trying to help me, I said finally, though the words tasted false in my mouth. My finances are complex. He has power of attorney because you let him, Samuel said. He said it without malice, just as fact. But that doesn't mean it's legal. That doesn't mean it's right. You don't know my situation, I said. I know you're a 73-year-old man who can't afford a $5 coffee, he said. I know you're living in a senior home on what should be your retirement. I know that someone had the authority to sell your house and move you somewhere you don't want to be. And I'm going to take a guess that person is your son. I didn't deny it. There was no point in lying. He'd already pieced together the essential elements of my humiliation. My father did something similar to me, Samuel said, leaning back in his chair. Different circumstances, same mechanism. Convinced everyone I was mentally incompetent. Took over my businesses, my properties. Spent years dismantling everything I'd built while claiming it was for my own good. It took me a decade to get it reversed. A decade of lawyers and court battles and proving that I was capable of managing my own affairs. But you did get it reversed, I said, hearing the hope in my own voice and hatting it. I did. I was fortunate. I had resources. I had friends who believed me when everyone else was accepting my father's narrative. And I was younger when it happened. I had time to rebuild. He said this last part with something like regret, and I understood he was thinking about my age, about the fact that whatever time remained to me was finite. I don't have resources, I said. I don't have friends. I have less than nothing, apparently. I have a son who controls everything about my life. Not everything, Samuel said. Not yet, but I suspect that's the plan. Have you thought about what happens when you die? I try not to think about that, I said, which was a lie. It was almost all I thought about. Your assets transfer to him, Samuel said. The house money, your savings, whatever is left, he inherits everything. And in exchange, he gets to control your life now. It's an efficient system, really. Ensures your compliance. Makes sure you don't cause problems. You're being slowly erased, and when you're finally gone, you won't have left anything behind except what he's allowed to remain. I wanted to argue with him. I wanted to maintain the fiction that Michael was simply being practical, responsible, concerned for my well-being. But I couldn't. I'd seen the hunger in my son's eyes when he'd taken inventory of my life. I'd felt the calculations happening beneath his words. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because I can, Samuel said. Because I was where you are, and I don't want anyone else to have to spend a decade clawing back their own life. Because I have the resources and the knowledge to help, if you want it. What would that involve? I asked carefully. First, a lawyer, a very good one. We'd need to examine the documents your son has you sign. We'd need to challenge the power of attorney, prove that you're capable of managing your own affairs. We'd need to untangle the financial arrangements. It would take time, it would take money, and it would require your cooperation. My son has money, I pointed out. If this became a legal matter, he'd have the resources to. Money matters less than you think, Samuel said. What matters is documentation. What matters is having someone who will testify on your behalf. What matters is proving a pattern of coercion. He said this with such certainty that for a moment I let myself believe it might be possible, that my life could be retrieved, that the slow erasure could be stopped. But then the fear returned, because fighting my son meant declaring war on the only family I had left. It meant not seeing Emma and Daniel, my grandchildren, who would almost certainly be convinced that I was being unreasonable, difficult, ungrateful. It meant becoming the villain in a story I had no control over. I can't fight him, I said. You already are, Samuel said. You're fighting by staying alive, by still being present, by not disappearing quietly the way he's planned for you. I didn't respond to that. We sat in silence for a while, and other customers came in and ordered coffee. The morning noise of the cafe continued around us. It was an ordinary scene, two men sitting in a coffee shop, having a conversation that felt like it might be important. But there was nothing ordinary about what Samuel was proposing, nothing ordinary about the possibility he was dangling in front of me. "I'm not going to pressure you," Samuel said eventually. "I'm going to give you my phone number. You're going to think about this, and if you decide you want to fight, you call me. If you decide you'd rather accept your fate, that's your decision. But understand what that decision means. It means accepting that your son has the right to control you. It means that your life, as you've known it, is over." He wrote his number on a napkin and pushed it across the table. "I come here most mornings around 9, he said. "If you want to talk more, you know where to find me." Then he got up and left. I sat with my coffee for another hour, watching people come and go. The napkin with Samuel's number felt like it was burning in my pocket. I wanted to throw it away. I wanted to forget I'd ever had this conversation. It would be easier to accept my current situation than to challenge it. Easier by infinitely. But underneath the fear was something else. Underneath the resignation was a small, defiant spark that had been smoldering for a year. The part of me that had refused to completely disappear. The part of me that remembered being a man who made decisions, who had agency, who mattered. I went back to Sunrise Gardens and lay on my bed for hours, staring at the ceiling. I thought about Margaret, about what she would want me to do. I thought about Emma and Daniel, about what example I was setting by accepting that I was too old to matter. I thought about Michael and whether he'd always been capable of this cruelty or whether I'd somehow invited it through my own passivity, my own willingness to let others take control. That evening, I called Samuel. "I want to fight," I said when he picked up. "I don't know if I can win, but I want to try." "Okay," he said. "Good. Come back to the cafe tomorrow morning. I'll introduce you to someone." The next morning, I told the staff at Sunrise Gardens that I was going for a walk. They didn't question it. They were trained not to question. I walked to the cafe, and Samuel was already there, sitting at the same table with another man, someone younger, maybe 40, with an intense expression and the bearing of someone who had spent his life fighting on behalf of other people. "This is David Huang," Samuel said. "He's a lawyer. He specializes in elder law and financial exploitation. I want you to tell him everything." So I did. I spent the next 4 hours laying out the entire architecture of my dispossession, Michael's first conversations about moving, the financial documents I'd been asked to sign without fully understanding them, the power of attorney, the house sale, the move to Sunrise Gardens, the allowance, or rather, the lack of it, the systematic way that every choice that had previously been mine had been transferred to my son. David listened without interrupting. He took notes. By the end, he had a stack of questions that made my head hurt. "Do you have copies of the documents?" he asked. "No," I said. "Michael keeps them." "We'll subpoena them," David said. "Do you have anyone who can testify on your behalf? Someone who can confirm that you're capable of managing your own affairs?" I thought about Shirley, the woman from Sunrise Gardens. I thought about the few friends I had maintained over the years, though I hadn't spoken to most of them in a long time. I thought about Margaret's sister, who I hadn't called since the funeral. "I don't know," I said. "Maybe people might not want to testify against my son. He's successful. He's respected. I trailed off." "You're the person whose rights are being violated," David finished. "That's who you are in this situation. That's the important thing." Over the next month, I did something I hadn't done in a year. I took action. I called Margaret's sister, Diane, and told her everything. I was terrified she wouldn't believe me, would side with Michael, would explain to me in gentle tones why he'd done what he'd done. Instead, she was quiet for a long moment and then said, "I always knew something was wrong. I just didn't know how to help." She became my first witness. I called some old friends, people I'd worked with over the years, who knew me before Margaret died, who could speak to my competence. Some didn't answer, some were evasive, but a few said yes, they would help. They would provide affidavits testifying to my capability. David filed a petition to revoke the power of attorney. He obtained all the documents through legal channels. He began building a case that my son had coerced me into signing away my autonomy, that the power of attorney had not been granted freely but under duress, that I was capable of managing my own affairs. The response from Michael was swift, and I have to admit, well executed. He sent me a letter, through his own lawyer, in which he expressed concern about my recent erratic behavior. He noted that I disappeared from the senior home without explanation, that I was meeting with lawyers, that I was attempting to undermine arrangements that were in my best interest. The letter suggested that I was showing signs of dementia. The letter hinted that if I continued on this path, he would pursue a full legal guardianship, which would strip me of all remaining rights. The threat was barely veiled. Fight him on the power of attorney, and he would take everything. I felt the weight of that threat. I understood what it meant, that if I lost this battle, I would lose not just my money, but any pretense of autonomy. I would be declared legally incompetent. I would become a ward of the state, or worse, a ward of my son. But I also understood that I had nothing left to lose. "This is good," David said when I showed him the letter. "This is exactly what we need. This is a threat. This is coercion. This is evidence of his pattern of behavior. This helps us." Michael also cut off my access to money entirely. The small allowance that had been provided for personal items stopped. He explained, through his lawyer, that he was concerned I was being taken advantage of. No one was surprised that this was happening. We'd expected it. But experiencing it was different from expecting it. Experiencing it meant I couldn't buy a coffee. It meant I was walking in worn shoes that were starting to give out. It meant I was dependent on Samuel's generosity for small meals at the cafe. This was, of course, a calculated move. Michael wanted me to feel the full weight of my dependence. He wanted me to understand the futility of fighting. He wanted me to come crawling back, apologizing, asking for mercy. Instead, it clarified something for me. It made me understand, in a way I hadn't before, that I was right to fight. A man who would respond to legal action by cutting off his elderly father's money, by threatening him with legal incapacity, by attempting to manipulate him back into submission. That man deserved to be fought. That man had already proven he couldn't be trusted with power over another person's life. The court date was set for 6 months away. 6 months of waiting, of depositions, of preparing testimony. 6 months during which Michael maintained the narrative that I was an unreliable, erratic old man who was making a terrible mistake. Patricia sent me an email expressing disappointment in my behavior. Michael didn't contact me at all. Emma and Daniel stopped calling. I learned through Diane that they'd been told I was having mental health issues, that I was making accusations without basis, that their father was simply trying to manage a difficult situation. They were teenagers, and from their perspective, what they'd been told made sense. Of course, their father was trying to help their grandfather. Of course, their grandfather was being difficult. That's what teenagers understand: power, authority, the natural hierarchy. The possibility that someone would deliberately harm a family member, that someone in authority would abuse it, that's not part of their framework yet. I grieved that loss, not having my grandchildren believe me, not being able to explain in a way they would understand what had happened. But I was learning that grief, too, was a luxury I could afford. During this period, something unexpected happened. Samuel became a friend, not in the casual way that people become friends, through shared activities or proximity or natural affinity, but in the deeper way, the way that happens between people who have genuinely saved each other's lives. He would meet me at the cafe most mornings. We'd talk about his situation with his father, how he'd rebuilt his life, the lessons he'd learned. We'd talk about my situation, about the upcoming court case. But mostly, we talked about the nature of family, the ways that people hurt each other, the possibility of redemption or at least acceptance. "I hate my father," Samuel said once. We were walking through a park near the cafe, a place where we'd started going when the weather was nice. "I spent years thinking that I had to forgive him, had to understand him, had to find some way to make peace with what he'd done. But I don't hate him less now that I understand his motivations. If anything, understanding makes it worse." "Do you have a relationship with him now?" I asked. "No," Samuel said. "He's still alive, but we haven't spoken in 4 years. My mother has tried to facilitate reconciliation. She sent him letters I've written, tried to convince us both that family is more important than past grievances. But I can't be around someone who hurt me like that. Some damage is permanent. I thought about Michael, about whether our relationship, if I won this battle, could ever be repaired. I thought about whether I even wanted it to be. I thought about the fact that he was my son and I was his father, and sometimes those biological facts were the cruelest lie of all, the suggestion that blood meant something, that it implied loyalty or care. "Do you regret fighting?" I asked Samuel. "Not for a single moment," he said. "The years of legal battles, the money, the stress, I'd do it all again, because the alternative was accepting that my own father had the right to control me. The alternative was dying without ever being myself again." The court date arrived. I was terrified in a way I hadn't been terrified before. I was terrified of losing, of having my petition rejected, of Michael using the legal process to solidify his control. But I was more terrified of the possibility of winning, because that would require me to rebuild a life with less than a decade, potentially, to do it. It would require acknowledging that I'd let this happen, that I'd been complicit in my own erasure. The courtroom was small and austere. Michael arrived in a suit that probably cost more than I'd earned in a month, with his lawyer, a sharp woman with immaculate hair, and a folder full of documents. I arrived with David and with Samuel, who sat in the public gallery as moral support. The judge was a woman in her 60s, with grey hair and an expression that suggested she'd seen this particular scenario many times before. She reviewed the documents quickly, asked some preliminary questions, and then we began. Michael's lawyer presented the case methodically. She talked about the complexity of financial management, about my admitted lack of financial literacy, about the ways that elderly people were vulnerable to exploitation. She presented the letters Michael had sent, the concerns he'd expressed. She suggested that I was motivated by an unhealthy desire to relive my youth, that I was being influenced by individuals with their own agendas, that I was acting against my own best interests. It was a good presentation. It was designed to be persuasive. It suggested that Michael wasn't malicious, he was just a responsible adult trying to manage a difficult situation. Then David presented our case. He presented the documents showing the power of attorney, the financial transfers, the power I'd gradually signed away. He presented the letter threatening guardianship. He presented the testimony from Diane, from my old friends, people who had known me and could attest to my competence. And then I testified. I'm not going to pretend it went perfectly. I stumbled over words. I got emotional. I had to pause several times when discussing the year I'd spent at Sunrise Gardens, the depression I'd experienced, the moment I'd stood in the parking lot and recognized that I was dying, not physically, but in every way that mattered. But I also spoke the truth. I talked about Margaret, about the quiet way she'd taught me to endure. I talked about the moment Michael came to my home with a real estate agent and told me I didn't have a choice. I talked about the growing realization that he had never seen me as a person, that I'd become, in his eyes, simply an asset to be managed, a legacy to be protected, a problem to be solved. I talked about the panic of recognizing that I'd been erased from my own life. Michael's lawyer cross-examined me, trying to catch me in contradictions, trying to suggest that I was confused or unreliable. But I didn't break. I had nothing left to protect except the truth. Then Michael himself testified. He was calm, articulate, seemingly reasonable. He explained that he loved me and was simply trying to help. He suggested that my concerns were the result of outside influence, that I'd been manipulated by unscrupulous individuals. He painted himself as the reasonable one, the responsible one, the child attempting to manage a parent's decline with grace and dignity. He lied very effectively. But something happened during his testimony. The judge asked him a specific question about the house sale, about whether I had agreed to it or whether it had been presented as non-negotiable. And for just a moment, Michael's mask slipped. A flash of something cold moved across his face. The judge saw it, I saw it, David saw it. That moment, more than anything I'd said, told the truth about Michael. The judge took 3 weeks to issue her ruling. 30 days of waiting, during which I returned to Sunrise Gardens and tried to exist in a state of suspended animation. 30 days of not knowing whether I'd won or lost, whether I could retrieve my life or whether I would spend my remaining years in legal limbo. The ruling came as a document delivered to David's office. I read it twice to make sure I understood it correctly. Power of attorney was revoked. The judge had found, based on the evidence presented, that I had been coerced into granting it, that it had not been given freely, and that I was capable of managing my own affairs. The financial arrangements that Michael had made on my behalf were to be unwound. I was granted access to my own bank accounts. The deed to the house that had been transferred in a way I didn't understand was being re-examined. There were going to be additional legal proceedings about that. I had won. I remember David telling me this and feeling nothing for a long moment. And then I felt everything. I felt the year of depression and loss. I felt the erasure. I felt the slow death of someone I used to be. And I felt, underneath all of that, the first tremor of something like hope. Michael immediately appealed. Of course he did. He had his lawyer file an appeal, arguing that the judge had misunderstood the documents, that I was being taken advantage of by outside influences, that the power of attorney had been granted appropriately and should be maintained. The appeal would take months. It would cost more money. It would mean another series of legal battles. But it no longer mattered whether he won the appeal. The first ruling had restored something that could not be taken back. It had declared that I was the rightful owner of my own life. It had said, officially and legally, that I mattered. I moved out of Sunrise Gardens 2 weeks later, once I had access to my own accounts again and could actually pay for my own living situation. Samuel helped me pack. There wasn't much to pack. A year in that place hadn't allowed me to accumulate anything meaningful, but there were my books. There was a small painting that Diane had given me when I asked if I could have something of Margaret's. There was the accumulation of small things that prove you exist. I didn't go far. I rented a small house in a neighborhood I didn't know, but that was the point. I wanted to live somewhere that didn't contain ghosts. I wanted to build something new without the weight of the past crushing it before it could take root. Samuel helped me move. He also helped me understand the financial situation I'd inherited, which was more complicated than I'd realized. Michael had made some investments that were dubious. Some of the money from the house sale had been spent on things I didn't understand, but there was enough left. There was enough to live on, to rebuild, to have the possibility of a future. Michael's appeal was denied. He filed another one, and that was denied as well. Eventually, he stopped fighting. I assume he concluded that the cost of continuing to pursue guardianship was greater than the benefit. He had control of nothing now. I had retrieved my autonomy. The grandchildren eventually reached out. By then they were college age, old enough to understand that the situation was more complicated than they'd been told. Emma came to visit once, awkwardly, apologizing for believing what she'd been told, trying to reconcile the image of me she'd been given with the person actually in front of her. I told her she had nothing to apologize for. She was a teenager. She'd believed her father. That was reasonable. Daniel didn't visit, but he sent an email. I'm sorry Dad treated you the way he did. I know it's not my place to apologize for him, but I wanted you to know that I see it now. I see what he did. That was enough. That was more than I'd expected. Michael and I haven't spoken since the courtroom. Patricia sent me a holiday card last year, a gesture that felt like it was trying to normalize something that could never be normal again. I sent one back, because I am still, at my core, a man who tries not to burn bridges unnecessarily, but there was nothing cordial in it. There was just the acknowledgement that we were related, and that was all. I'm 77 now, living in a house I rent, working part-time at a used bookstore, because I need something to do, something to be, beyond just the man who survived his own erasure. I have a small life, but it's mine. Every decision is mine. Every failure is mine. Every success is mine. Samuel and I see each other a few times a week. We've become something like brothers, I think, though I'm hesitant to use familial language anymore. We understand each other in a way that transcends family. We've both been betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect us. We've both learned that the people you expect to help you are sometimes the ones trying to destroy you. But we've also both learned that there are people in the world, strangers really, in the beginning, who will see you when everyone else has decided you're invisible. who will sit with you in a coffee shop and recognize the moment when your life is being stolen, who will fight for your right to exist as a person. The appeal of my case has reached a higher court. Michael's lawyers are preparing for another round. I'm told there's an excellent chance that the decision will be upheld, but nothing is certain. There's a part of me that doesn't care anymore. Even if Michael somehow prevails in the end, he's already lost the thing he was after. He can't control me anymore. He can't erase me. I've proven that I exist, that I matter, that my life belongs to me. This is what I would tell other people who find themselves where I was, invisible and erased, their autonomy draining away like sand through an hourglass. I would tell them that it's possible to fight. I would tell them that they're not too old, not too past their prime, not too irrelevant to deserve their own lives. I would tell them that the machinery of their destruction can be halted, not easily, not without pain, but it's possible. And I would tell them that there are people, strangers, who recognize when someone is being destroyed, who will offer a napkin with a phone number, who will sit with you in a coffee shop and see you when everyone else has decided you're gone. I don't know if Michael will ever understand what he did, or whether he'd do it differently if he had the chance. I suspect he'll continue to believe he was trying to help, that I was ungrateful, that I made his life difficult by refusing to accept the natural order of things. That's the story he needs to believe about himself. I can't change that. But I can live with the knowledge that I didn't disappear. I stayed present, I stayed angry, I stayed alive. And that, at 77 years old, turns out to be enough. Epilogue. It's now 3 years after my victory in court. Michael's appeals have been exhausted. I retain full control of my finances and my life. The house that my wife and I built together, the one I never thought I'd own outright again, we're still working through the legal tangles, but it looks like that situation will be resolved in my favor as well. I work at the bookstore 3 days a week. I read voraciously. I take walks through neighborhoods I don't know well, watching the world move around me, no longer invisible, because I've learned that invisibility was a choice someone else was making for me, not something inherent to my age or my circumstances. Samuel and I volunteer together at a legal aid clinic, helping other elderly people who are being financially exploited by their families. Some of them are further along than I was. Some of them are just beginning to realize that something is wrong. We sit with them, show them that it's possible to fight back, that age doesn't mean you lose the right to your own autonomy. Emma called me last month to tell me she'd been accepted to law school. She said she wants to specialize in elder law, in protecting people from situations like the one I experienced. I told her I was proud of her. I meant it. She's young enough that maybe she can change the system before another person disappears the way I almost did. Margaret's sister, Diane, has become a regular presence in my life. We have dinner together on Sundays. We talk about Margaret, about the years we lived as neighbors, about the life we built and the lives we're building now, separate and together. I haven't become a different person. I'm still quiet. I'm still the kind of man who could walk into a room full of strangers and be the last person anyone remembers. But I'm aware now that that's not invisibility. That's just my personality, my nature. There's a difference between being overlooked and being erased. There's a difference between being quiet and being silenced. I still think about Margaret, about what she would think of how this all turned out. I like to believe she would be proud. I like to believe she would understand that sometimes endurance isn't enough. Sometimes you have to fight. 3 weeks ago, I received a letter from Michael. His handwriting was the same as it had always been, precise, controlled. The letter was brief. He wanted to arrange a time to talk. He said there were things he needed to say, and he didn't think it was right to let his mistakes define our relationship forever. I haven't responded. I don't know if I will. There's a part of me that's curious what he would say, what explanation he might offer, but there's a larger part of me that understands that some bridges, once burned, shouldn't be rebuilt. Some relationships, once violated, don't recover. I'm 77 years old, and I finally understand that it's okay to protect yourself. It's okay to say no. It's okay to be alone rather than be with someone who has shown you their true nature. This is the rest of my story. This is what comes after erasure, Not a fairy tale recovery, not a magical restoration of everything that was lost, but a quiet rebuilding, a slow reclamation of the ground beneath my feet. And maybe that's what matters, not the victory in court, though that was important, but the knowledge that I was still here, I was still alive, I was still the author of my own days. That turned out to be enough.